So, are we just redoing the 1930s? Propagandists from the military industrial complex have been trying to convince us of that forever. And this channel is mostly dedicated to mocking that kind of thing. This idea that a 1930s Germany is around every corner and coming to get us. And I've always found that kind of ridiculous. But it's hard to deny, sitting here in the second Trump administration, that things are looking a little 1930s. Like the signs are getting kind of hard to ignore. It looks disturbingly likely that we are about to see another economic collapse driven by oligarchic greed that leads to a massive depression, just like the 1920s. In the 1930s, this depression overturned a world system that was already based on U.S. sponsorship. We don't really like to admit that so much in the United States, but if you look at the history honestly, it's clear it was already a U.S.-based system. We just didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't adequately support it, and then we helped to create a depression that collapsed all of it. By the 1930s, Italy was already run by a fascist dictator. Japan and Germany in the 1920s had tried really hard to fit themselves into the U.S. system by having more elections and more sort of liberal democratic-ish looking systems, though they were never really that healthy, and they were very dependent on U.S. support, which was withdrawn, of course, during the Great Depression. So we got these really horrifically criminal elements. Mussolini was always kind of a joke, but 1940s Germany and Japan committed incredible crimes, horrible crimes, some of which are well memorialized, some of which have sort of been forgotten completely. But all of these horrible crimes that Germany and Japan committed came down to something called revisionism. Fundamentally, they were revisionist powers. Revisionism is a great concept that isn't talked about often enough. What made the German and Japanese crimes so extreme was the fact that they wanted to revise the world order. They wanted to take the way things were, a solidifying U.S. empire, and overturn it. They wanted to do something different, and by smashing the old order, they created a high level of chaos, a high level of destruction in the world system. They are the reason why the 1930s and the 1940s got as bad as they were, because Germany and Japan wanted to revise the way things were done, and they wanted to revise things violently. So what's so scary now, and what I've been talking about for a while now, but is now pretty much impossible to deny, is that the United States is the revisionist power. Despite the fact that we've spent 80 years as the leader and the biggest beneficiary of the U.S. world system we set up in the 1940s and the 1950s, we want to change everything for the benefit of our military-industrial complex, because honestly, we did such a good job setting up the world that there is very little left for the military-industrial complex to do. So we go looking for fights. We want to revise this system that works so well for everybody else and works so well for us because we just want to spend money on weapons. That's the sad fact. That's what's driving us towards the 1930s again. And this long predates Donald Trump. Since 2018, officially, and for decades before that, the United States has been dedicated to destroying any Chinese, Russian, or European influence in their regions. This is why we are now fighting with Russia over Russia-speaking territories, China over Chinese-speaking territories, and it is one of many reasons why we've spent the past quarter century turning the Middle East into a flaming dumpster fire. We used to be better at public relations. This policy of revisionism used to be better hidden. With Trump, the mask has fallen off completely. In the first Trump administration, this revisionist policy called Great Power Competition was enshrined in U.S. national strategy documents. They were quite honest about what they were going to do, but we were also distracted by Trump that nobody really followed through on what we were saying here. We basically said, in 2017, we made it U.S. policy to go out and start fights with Russia and China. Somehow this fact is never connected to the fact that a war with Russia in Ukraine started just 3 or 4 years later. It's just, those dots never ever quite get connected. In the second Trump administration, with the failure of his already quite suspect plans at the feet of Donald Trump's incredible incompetence and inability to do anything, his plans are probably pretty bad. His execution has been utterly abysmal. So what he's left with is pure aggression. With the nonstop failure of the second Trump administration, he's just lashing out at everybody. He's, more extreme against Russia than Biden ever was. He's bombing Iran. He's threatening to invade Venezuela. He's murdering random people in boats in the Caribbean. And he's going after our allies. Like 8 months ago, it would have been really controversial to say that the United States is acting as a revisionist power like 1940s Germany or Japan. But after what we've seen in the second Trump administration so far, it's impossible to deny it. Like he's coming right out and saying that the United States should invade and take parts of Greenland and Canada. Like that is straight up like 1940s German mustache guy stuff, that we should invade and take over all our neighbors. You got to be like Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu, or Donald Trump to think that that's like an okay thing to do. Trump made conquest his explicit policy, and that's even before he started crashing the economy. Things are about to get a lot worse. What Trump is doing here with his insane attacks on India, South Korea, Qatar, all of these actors that, many of them hold U.S. military forces or important strategic allies. What he's doing here is eating the seed corn, eating the corn that you need for the next season to continue to grow crops. Or another good analogy would be he's killing the golden goose here. Like the United States benefits incredibly from U.S. empire. Our alliances are the only hope we could have ever had to compete with China in Asia. I think on our second Trump administration, that chance is pretty much passed. But to the extent we ever had a chance of competing with China, defending Taiwan, not that was necessarily such a great idea, it relied on actors like South Korea and India. And Trump is now just 8 months into his 48-month second term, has decided to do everything he can to alienate these allies. Like it is quite insane, frankly. Like we run the world and Donald Trump is doing everything he can to screw that up. Quite surprising. And frankly, it's terrifying because it's like somebody who owns everything deciding to burn the house down because somehow that'll make them more powerful. Like it's truly insanity. But that's another parallel with the 1930s. Trump's ideas here are insanely self-defeating, and it's just idiotic to think that he's making us stronger by blowing up shipping in neutral waters or antagonizing all these places that host U.S. bases full of troops. But insane, self-defeating policies is just standard authoritarianism. That is very 1930s. There was never a likely prospect of success for the plans of 1940s Germany or 1940s Japan. They were just people who had deluded themselves so much that, by putting together this performance of strength and brutality and, quite frankly, evil, that somehow that was like a victory somehow. And Donald Trump is doing the same stuff. It's the same playbook. We're incredibly blessed by the fact that he's very, very ineffectual, that he's like a total moron. But this is straightforward authoritarianism. That's what he wants to do. That is what he's trying to do. That is what I believe he's going to fail to do, but it's terrifying. And if we really do get an economic collapse, which I think is pretty likely, something like 7% of U.S. GDP is like 7 tech companies whose valuation is entirely based on a fantasy of a robot god. Like I think an economic collapse is very likely, and that will make the president, be it Donald Trump or one of his successors after his brain finally falls out of his ears, will give them the opportunity to act in much, much more authoritarian ways. This is pretty scary. This is looking pretty 1930s. And to make it even worse, a revisionist United States is much more structurally powerful than the revisionist Germany and Japan of the 1940s were. the Japanese were always going to lose. Like their only hope, one of the reasons they were as brutal as they were, is because their only hope was to scare the lazy Americans out of using their wealth and power to crush them, and that was a complete failure. Germany's only hope was to keep the United States and Russia out of it, and they were led by a madman who went and picked fights with Russia and the United States, which is, to find something as ridiculous in world policy, you really have to look at Donald Trump. And his brutalizing the South Koreans who he wanted to be sent here to build more manufacturing jobs for the United States. Like, it's just, these things never, ever made sense. And Donald Trump is just as illogical, is just as much of a mess, but I don't know necessarily that J.D. Vance is. And the United States doesn't have the structural constraints that Germany and Japan do. Japan was basically entirely reliant on U.S. petrochemicals for most of its 1930s sort of savage revisionist rise. Germany was also really reliant on outside energy resources and had to go to extreme lengths to feed its military machine. I think turning coal into liquid gas, sort of is an accomplishment that's even impressive now, almost 100 years later. So in the 1930s, revisionist Germany and Japan were destined to fail as soon as the other powers that they had chosen to fight got over themselves enough to join together. So U.S. and the British Empire together probably could have been enough to defeat both of those powers eventually. But once Russia jumped in on the U.S. and British Empire side, it was over. It was done. Like, structurally, it just wasn't going to work. It was interesting watching India and China and Russia meeting together in Tianjin for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all those leaders together, kind of shocking footage from the context of even the Biden administration, have Modi showing up there or what have you. Directly as a result of Trump's antagonizing of India. But, I looked at that and I could only think of like Yalta or Tehran, these famous meetings between FDR and his counterparts, the victorious allies who really just a year or so into the conflict got to meet together and talk about what was going to happen next. And I got to say, Xi Jinping, Modi, Putin, that's no FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. That's no British Empire, Soviet Union, and the United States. That's no Yalta. That's not going to work. Those folks come from very populous countries, of course, but they are so weak and so dependent on the U.S. system as it exists currently. The United States has created, it now looks more like a group of hostages than allies, but we have created a much more powerful group of folks that are stuck with us anyway. Unlike the 1930s, 1940s world system, where the revisionist powers were kind of guaranteed to lose, the United States isn't guaranteed to lose. If the United States was run by a savvier authoritarian, like a J.D. Vance or someone else coming up, it's actually quite plausible that we could create a true worldwide empire on a much more brutal set of circumstances, like set of approaches. Like it's actually really terrifyingly doable. In fact, we'd already kind of done it. Like we could actually just switch like turn a toggle towards more bloody, and the empire that we'd already set up that was successful for everybody for 80 years could become a much worse one. So like that's the scarier version of the 1930s here, where actually the United States, unlike 1940s Germany, unlike 1940s Japan, could actually carry out sort of the nuclear Napoleonic dream of people like Napoleon, 1940s Germany mustache guy. It's like actually plausible. And that's terrifying. But this is not actually meant to be a scary downer of a video. There are certainly scary downer possibilities, but I actually do not believe we are in the 1930s for a variety of very important structural reasons. That actually the world is in a much more durable and much more resilient space than it was during the 1930s, or that it was in the 1910s before World War I, or for all of the 19th century. And the reason we're in a much more stable place is something that often gets sort of poo-pooed or looked down on in a big way, and it's nationalism. It is broad-based nationalism in every region and country in the world. And I think that alone means we're in a completely different space from where we were back in the 1930s. And that's why I believe that no matter how scary and powerful the revisionist United States is, there is no real comparing this era to the World War I, World War II, Great Depression era that looks kind of similar in some ways of a century before. The main difference between the 1930s and the 2020s is that the whole world is not run by a couple bankrupt European empires. That was really the case where we were in the 1930s. And it was because, in part, those empires were so fragile and so illegitimate that Germany and Japan thought it was possible to sort of like shoot their shot and change everything. Things were incredibly unsettled in the 1930s. The 19th century system of Europe controlling everything. Sorry, it was really just the late 19th century system of Europe controlling everything had never really been super viable. It had sort of like limped along in the 1880s, 90s, and then the 1910s, and then it ended in apocalypse in World War I. The weird thing, I think largely because of U.S. support for the largest empires, the British Empire and the French Empire, in World War I, we got to this weird space in the 1920s where those empires were still kind of limping along with U.S. support, financial and otherwise, and still believed that they controlled the whole world. And they believed this despite the fact that they were bankrupt and the fact that their attempts at sort of worldwide white supremacy and subjection of every sense of personal dignity or nationalism anywhere else in the world was just falling to tatters. Like, they didn't have the money to back it up. And World War I had shown that actually European civilization was not superior. It was just had more potential for barbarism than anybody else did. So that's the world of the 1930s. And that is a tremendous contrast. So it was already shaky and subject to domination, the sort of world of the 1890s or what have you, and incredible unevenness in the powers of the folks attempting to be imperialists and the folks that were being colonized. And then World War I made it even more shaky, and it was just a flood of U.S. money that kept things kind of limping along in the 1920s. And then when that flood stopped with the Great Depression, it really was like a space of complete chaos with European countries trying to hold on every continent, making no sense. Like, just, it was primed for disaster. What's different today is actually a story of success of U.S. world system building. Is that what had sort of started in kind of a half-assed way after World War I. It was sort of only available to a bunch of Eastern European countries that quickly got swallowed up by the Soviet Union and 1940s Germany. But it was this idea that, well, actually everybody should have a measure of self-determination. Now, that's not like entirely equally distributed all over the world, but 80 years after the end of World War II, it is a system of individual nation states that has extraordinary legitimacy. Over the past decade, we've seen some of the weakest states in the world, with the least established national ideas, not complete control over their own territory. But we've actually seen the countries in the Sahel, those countries under the Sahara in Africa, some of the poorest country in the world, kick out the United States, kick out France. Actually, like, that's how strong the ideas of nationalism are, that even the countries that have adopted it the least and are having the most trouble establishing their own control have managed to stymie the efforts of imperial powers like the United States and France and kick them out. I'm not saying that's a universally happy story. I think probably they'll be better off in the long run without France and the United States, but it's an indicator that even the weakest states have the power to stymie empires now. And throughout Africa, there are much stronger states with a much more firmly developed sense of their nationalism, their rights, their dignity. There is no question of any Russian, Chinese, American, European power coming in there and being able to assert themselves the way that they used to. Like Mussolini, the most ridiculous loser of all the ridiculous loser totalitarians of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, was able to take over huge swaths of territory in Ethiopia. That's simply not going to happen in today's world system. And Africa is the place where these modern tools of nationalism, military modernization, mass literacy, mass culture, that's the place where the footprint is lightest. Like Vladimir Putin has just provided a masterclass in how pointless conquest is in the 21st century. The United States has provided multiple masterclasses on that in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And, it's true that Canada has no military, but I think it's not at all surprising that after sort of floating the idea a little bit, we're like, ooh, we're going to invade Canada, Trump hasn't been talking about that so much anymore because of this understanding that any country trying to invade any other country is going to lose. So the potentialities of a sort of nuclear Napoleonic United States are a lot lower than even the potentialities for mass conquest that the 1940s Germans and the Japanese had, which they failed to execute. Beyond the stability that our modern nation-state system provides, we also have the gift of really, really bad demographics. This is, I think, rightly lamented in most circles, the idea that, oh gosh, we might be running out of people, and all of our welfare states and our social security systems depend on there being people who are just being born anymore, and that's terrifying. But it also means that each individual person is a lot more valuable. In the first half of the 20th century, when we had World War I, World War II, Europeans, Americans were having kids at levels of sub-Saharan Africa today, or even higher. Like, it was normal. It was Saving Private Ryan. The guy has four brothers and they all die, or what have you. It wasn't normal for four brothers to all die, but it wasn't that strange to have a family with four people. A family with, a mother and father that had four kids. During World War II, this was the case for like all of the combatants, which made it a lot easier for societies to absorb the deaths of a few people. At this point, where certainly the United States, but also China, more so China, is in a demographic situation where you have whole big inverted pyramids of grandparents, parents dependent on a single son, you're not going to send this person off to fight a war. This is also the case for the United States. The United States has some trouble filling its all-volunteer force, but if we were to get into a situation where we needed conscription again, where we had a fight anywhere near on the same level of the intensity of what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine, all of a sudden you would be taking away a lot of the people that, similar inverted pyramids depend on. You simply can't take anywhere near as many people to use as cannon fodder in a war anymore. It's not possible in the way that it was in the 1920s and the 1930s. Trump is a very 1930s authoritarian figure. That's really, really scary. But he's also incompetent, and he's also an anachronism. He can pretend to be super tough and be the guy who's going to conquer everything and conquest, but that's just not the world we live in anymore. This is demonstrated over and over and over again by the United States in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, by Russia in Afghanistan, and now in Ukraine. It's just not something you can do anymore. Again, the Russia and Ukraine battlefield in particular is exhibiting this. As we've seen the conflict go on, we've seen that the weapons involved have been getting more democratic and cheaper. The Ukrainians are building tons of their drones in distributed shops with 3D printers. Like Ukraine, not to diminish the savvy and innovativeness of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, but it's not, what makes it so innovative is that it's not something that most countries can't do. Meaning it's not, fighting a big war successfully, or at least defending yourself successfully, is not just the province of extremely expensive weapon systems anymore. We've seen with the conflict between Israel and Iran just how quickly those expensive systems get exhausted, and you're left on a much more even playing field. We saw that in the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Russia thought they were going to pull like a U.S. versus Iraq in 2003 thing, and Russia thought they were going to come in with their special forces and their really hotsy-totsy new pieces of equipment that they didn't have that many of, and they were going to just do everything really quickly. Well, all those forces got exhausted very quickly, and it was just thrown back on the basics of grinding warfare with fairly cheap munitions. I think the story is a little bit more complicated than what I just portrayed there, but I think the general principle holds that we're seeing like a democratization of the weapons of war. If Trump attacks Venezuela, sure, he's going to be able to assassinate Maduro or maybe crush some governing functions, but then actually controlling Venezuelan territory, that's simply no longer possible. Horrifyingly, and this is like a different thing, it's becoming clear in the Middle East that the United States and its proxy state Israel are quite content to just leave spaces ungoverned, which is, of course, an idiotic thing to do long term. Ungoverned space is what gave us the Houthis, who are one of the more powerful and frightening elements in this new environment. That's sort of a different question. Like, can we have like true like world beating, invading everybody, new wannabe empire builders the way we had in the 1930s? No. That's just not how militaries work. That's just not how current nation states work. That's just not how literacy and everybody's assumption that their own country has dignity works. It's just not something that happens anymore. Honestly, the main thing we've seen since the end of the Cold War, possibly since the end of World War II, is the struggle between the U.S. military-industrial complex and the U.S. empire that was built in the 1940s. The system of independent, nationalistic, sovereign nation states that really didn't exist before 1945 and frankly didn't exist until the 1970s, and the European empires were finally allowed to die, but now truly exists. And I'm not saying this is some special virtue of early U.S. empire builders, though obviously like the early New Deal era U.S. empire builders were a lot smarter than pretty much all the chumps that have followed them from the 1960s and certainly from the 1980s on. But this was just where the world was going anyway after industrialization. I think it's probably been to the world's benefit in some ways that it was the United States that benefited the most from industrialization. But I think that even under a much nastier world hegemon, I think this is where we were trending with the democratizing effects of technology and information spreads and mass literacy and mass nationalism. I think that the U.S., we're running out of time to do this, but I think the U.S. could still claim some credit for the massive peace dividend that the world got after World War II. But I think it's just naturally the way the world was going to go with this basket of technologies. And despite the fact that we've elected somebody, Donald Trump, and honestly, we've had a succession of presidents that have acted in ways that are raging against the U.S. settlement after World War II, Trump being the most egregious rager against that system. Despite all of that, I think that the post-World War II system is likely to persist, because there is a limit to how much damage Donald Trump can do, and a limit to how much damage the U.S. military-industrial complex can do. We target a particular country. This is true in like the larger sense of what the U.S. did to Iraq during the Bush administration, but even in the smaller sense of what Donald Trump did to South Korea by arresting all those engineers that came to the Georgia plant to build American jobs. The United States has the capacity to do horrible things to a place without any kind of reciprocal challenges. It's not like Iraq was able to invade and destabilize the United States. It's not like South Korea can arrest a whole bunch of U.S. workers, though it wouldn't surprise me if they tried. But the cost in the longer term, after that first satisfying burst of violence in March of 2003 when we invaded Iraq, and certainly, and I think all the months that are going to follow, at least this year, or possibly in the Trump administration, in the U.S.-South Korean relationship, it just gets worse and worse for the Central Power that attempts to take violent advantage of the other country. The United States is a revisionist power. This was true before Donald Trump. This is certainly more true under Donald Trump. But it's a failing strategy, even for the most powerful country in human history. So that's why, even though in some ways the analogies of today to the 1930s look more scary, I believe we are not, in fact, in the 1930s. We are, in fact, unlikely to fall into like that level of catastrophe. Obviously, the United States is the largest threat here, but I think there's a limit to even what we can do because of the system of U.S. empire that was set up by our forebears. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And if you'd consider signing up on my Patreon, I'd be very grateful. You get access to 2 patrons-only exclusive events every month, and you get access to our patrons-only Discord server, where we've got some really smart folks talking about world events all the time. It's a pretty great resource that I'd suggest. Thanks.